Joining us for more on what really the deal entails, what can we expect in coming days. At the moment, we have Alan Eyre, who, of course, has been a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute, is currently there and has also been part of the JCPOA, of course, who was directly involved in the negotiations. Thank you so much, Alan, for speaking to Times Now. And let me begin with the newly signed 14-point US-Iran Memorandum of Understanding, which calls for an immediate ceasefire, the lifting of US naval blockade and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. There's also sanctions relief for Iran oil exports. This leaves the Iranian regime, which is firmly in place with a lot on the plate. If these are the broad contours of the agreement, what exactly did President Trump achieve through a conflict that lasted more than 3 months?
Well, the conflict was originally mistaken, I believe. It should never have happened. The U.S. has achieved none of its war goals. Iran still has a nuclear program. It still has a defense industrial base, and it's even more of a threat to the region than it was before the war started. But this is what the ceasefire achieved. It started the procedures to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and that was the most urgent issue, because every day, the strait remains closed, more and more global economic damage was going to follow. So President Trump eventually realized this and moved to effect a ceasefire and to reopen the strait.
But the strait wouldn't have shut in the first place if there was no conflict. So if there was no war, there would be no shutting down of the strait.
Exactly right. I'm not saying the war was a good idea. I'm saying the exact opposite. It was a very bad idea. The good news is that after 100 days of sustained strategic failure, President Trump and his administration have realized that and have tried to minimize the damage being done by this war. So you're right.
Yeah.
We'll never get back to the way it was before the war. If we're lucky, the maritime traffic through the strait will increase, but it's a real question as to whether it will ever get back to pre-war volumes.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're referring to this as a failure, because on the other side, we see the rhetoric coming in from President Trump, because he's claiming victory at a time when Iran has retained leverage over so many issues that I just mentioned. These were all issues that were supposed to be resolved through maximum pressure at the end of the day.
Well, let's not give too much credit to Iran, because to be honest, both sides have lost. The U.S. lost in that it didn't achieve any of its strategic objectives. But don't forget, the Iranian economy was horrible before this war started. It will be even worse, even with the ability to export its oil once this war ends. So Iran achieved its strategic goals in this war. It survived, and it didn't capitulate to any U.S. demands about moving its red lines. But the U.S. failed in that it didn't achieve its strategic objectives. But in a real sense, both sides are losing.
Right. And how do you explain the contrast between Trump's earlier demand for Iran's unconditional surrender, and later on we're looking at now a deal based on negotiations, the sanctions relief and economic incentives also thrown in? So what do you think America has actually won from the war in terms of taking away from this?
Well, as I said, America has won nothing, but it could have lost a lot more had it continued. So America is cutting its losses. The problem is, or one of the many problems is, this war has caused a real decrease in America's stature globally. You know, it used to be the case, other countries in the world were used to U.S. policies changing from administration to administration, but now you've got a case where U.S. policy is changing repeatedly and continuously within the same administration. It's very confusing for the rest of the world.
I was actually about to ask you about the foreign policy itself, because, does this really enhance Trump's foreign policy legacy, or does this expose a gap between the rhetoric that has been coming out and even his own position? Because he had said that he's somebody who's not going to engage in war before he came into office, and he's done exactly the opposite.
Yeah, I really don't think we can speak with any credibility about President Trump's foreign policy legacy. He started numerous military actions. Even though we've got a ceasefire in Gaza, Israel is still continuing in Gaza. It's continuing in the West Bank. It's going to continue in Lebanon. So I'm at a loss to ascertain what foreign policy achievements this administration can lay claim to. But as I said, the good news is that finally President Trump has realized what an egregious mistake he has made in this war. And of course, he's going to spin it in a positive way. That's just politicians. But the good news is he's at least taking steps to de-escalate and reopen the strait.
I must also ask you, Alan, as you were part of the team that negotiated the 2015 JCPOA. Now, President Trump has called it the worst deal ever. He's quoted to be saying that. And now, after this deal of President Trump, how do you see the narrative, and how do you see, if you were to compare both deals, would you say that that's a fair assessment on part of President Trump at all?
Well, I know President Trump has said it's the worst deal ever. So let's see the deal he's done. Right now, you can't compare the JCPOA to a President Trump equivalent because he hasn't negotiated any nuclear deal with Iran. Part of this MOU is just kicking the can down the road and saying, we will now start to negotiate a nuclear agreement. Now, it's possible he could negotiate a deal better than Obama's. I think it's highly unlikely, but let's see what he does.
Because, that's exactly what we're all waiting for. And you're right, the fine print isn't completely out yet. There are some reports of what it really contains. But if you look at, the aspects of the relaxation of sanctions, the larger issues of regional instability, and the possibility of direct conflict once again, because there's also the fact of Israel saying that they are not party to this deal, and what they may do, we don't know. But when you talk about nuclear enrichment limits, the fine print itself is going to reveal a lot. Would you say that if the JCPOA had remained in place, would the world have been in a better position than it is today?
Yeah, first of all, we can't talk about the fine print because there's no print. There was no nuclear concessions made by Iran in this MOU other than to say, let's talk about our nuclear program. So it's not a question of it. There's no print. In terms of your question, obviously, the world would have been far better off if President Trump had decided to renegotiate the JCPOA if he thought he could get a better deal without pulling out of it. I can understand if he thought the Obama deal was a bad deal, he could have reopened it. But the key point here is that the JCPOA proved that you could get results through diplomacy. And maybe it was imperfect, but it was good enough to put the Iran's nuclear program in a box. By ripping up the JCPOA, it allowed Iran's nuclear program to become much more advanced. And so now President Trump is going to have a much harder time getting Iran's nuclear program back where we have a good sense that they're not trying to weaponize.
Right. And, when we talk about America's regional allies, particularly Israel, coming out and expressing concern that the deal could leave Iran economically stronger without fundamentally changing its strategic behavior, how should the U.S. balance those security concerns with the goal of preventing another major regional war? Because there are many who believe that this agreement or this truce or this ceasefire is one that is extremely fragile, given what is happening in Lebanon and other theaters.
Well, that's certainly what the new Iranian regime believes. They don't believe this is peace. They believe this is a ceasefire that could end at any moment, just like the June 2025 war resumed this February with the February 28th attacks. So we shouldn't call this peace. Iran is not going to act as if it's peace. Iran has already said that the government will be a post-war government or a war-footing government. They're going to try to rebuild their defense industrial base. They're going to rebuild their rockets, their missiles. They're going to maintain control of the strait so they can close it again should they need to. So, yeah, this is a very, very unstable and fragile ceasefire. And as you said, Israel is going to be trying very hard to destabilize it and try to drag America back into an armed confrontation with Iran.
Right. And, your rich experience as someone who spent years sort of engaging directly with Iran officials, trying to understand how Iran's politics and its political culture works. What is your assessment of the current Iranian leadership's willingness to compromise? There's a lot of talk and rhetoric about how it's a more hardline leadership now. What is your assessment? Because the larger question is whether a devastating war such as this has strengthened the pragmatists or the hardliners within Iran.
Yeah, well, there's no question in my mind. The pragmatists have been sidelined. They have for a while. This war accelerated dynamics that already existed. The Islamic Republic of Iran is essentially a militaristic security state run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. And as a result, the decapitation strikes the U.S. and Israel did, the people running Iran right now are more hardline, more militaristic, less risk averse, and more anti-U.S. So this is one of the reasons why I say we have worsened the Iranian threat. and the region is less stable. It could be the case that this new Iranian regime actually tries to get nuclear weapons, something it didn't do before the war.
Right. On the aspect of, the entire nuclear dust, which of course you also refer to, while Iran has agreed to downblend the enriched uranium stockpile, but can uranium really be diluted? There are many experts who say that it cannot be done. And if Tehran retains its centrifuges, the nuclear infrastructure, the kind of technical know-how that it has, does this deal genuinely eliminate the threat, or is this merely, preserving Iran's ability to rapidly re-enrich uranium if negotiations such as these collapse in the future?
Well, first of all, there is no way without occupying Iran with your own troops to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat or the nuclear program, because that program is in the minds of thousands of scientists and technicians. We can destroy centrifuges and installations, which we've done. We can take the highly enriched uranium, which is what you're talking about, the 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, and downblend it or dilute it so it's not close to weapons grade uranium, but Iran retains the ability to build centrifuges and enrich uranium. So this is why the only solution to Iran's nuclear threat is diplomacy. And we might not get it, because I think it's going to be very hard for the Trump administration to negotiate a worthwhile nuclear agreement with Iran as a result of this war.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm going to come to that. I was actually about to refer to the challenge for this regime, because, as far as the JCPOA era is concerned, it was a challenge then as well to convince Tehran that any future US administration would honor the commitments that are being made by a predecessor. Now, since the US has withdrawn from the agreement despite Iranian compliance being repeatedly certified by international inspectors, why would Iranian negotiators then today trust that any new regime will survive future political transitions, or agreement would survive future transitions such as these in Washington, D.C.?
Well, that's a very good point, and I agree with you, but trust has nothing to do with international negotiations. Here's the reality. Any negotiated agreement will survive only as long as both sides see it in their interest to stick to it. You are right. Iran has realized that even if it complies with a nuclear agreement, the U.S. could pull out of it for any reason. So again, any agreement with Iran and the United States is going to be tentative because of the total lack of trust. That's why you have to construct an agreement that is in many ways win-win and that benefits both sides, so you enhance the chances of them staying in it.
All right. Alan Eyre, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us here at Times Now.
Thank you so much for inviting me.